Margaret Whitmore woke up to a quiet morning, the kind of silence that feels both peaceful and haunted. At 60, she had grown accustomed to the stillness of her house in Fairhaven, a small town where everyone knew each other's routines, but rarely each other's secrets. Her house sat atop a small hill, its white shutters always slightly ajar, like eyes that watched the world pass by. She sat up slowly, her back stiff from years of teaching, age, and solitude. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 7:03 a.m. right on schedule. She always woke up at the same time, no matter how restless her sleep was. The kettle in the kitchen had just begun to hum when she heard a knock at the back door. Unusual, no one came by this early, especially not to the back. She tied her robe tightly around her waist and moved cautiously through the hallway, peering through the curtain that framed the glass. It was Vanessa, her daughter-in, tall, dressed far too formally for a morning visit, and wearing that wide smile that Margaret never trusted. Margaret opened the door slightly. "Vanessa, what brings you here?" "I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by, check on you. Can I come in?" Margaret hesitated, then opened the door fully, stepping aside. "Of course." Vanessa stepped in briskly, her heels tapping lightly on the hardwood. She was carrying a small tote bag and a box of pastries from a local French bakery, the expensive kind Margaret only allowed herself on birthdays. "I brought breakfast," Vanessa said brightly, setting the box on the table and unpacking its contents like she was arranging flowers. "And I'll make coffee." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You'll make the coffee?" Vanessa smiled again, a little too wide. "Consider it a peace offering." Margaret didn't say anything. Instead, she sat down slowly at the kitchen table and watched Vanessa move around the kitchen. She moved with too much familiarity, opening the right cabinets on the first try, choosing Margaret's favorite mug from the second shelf without hesitation. That mug was never in front. That mug hadn't been used in weeks. She watched her carefully. Vanessa poured filtered water into the electric kettle, then pulled a small glass vial from her tote bag and dropped it into the sink behind her. A quick motion, too quick for an untrained eye. But Margaret noticed. She said nothing. The coffee began to brew. The rich aroma filled the kitchen, bitter and warm, but to Margaret, it felt foreign. She remembered something her mother once told her, that evil rarely wears an ugly face. Most times, it shows up in pressed skirts and smiles made of sugar. Margaret never believed in melodrama, but something in her gut churned. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, and watched. Vanessa brought over 2 cups of coffee, steam curling up from the rims. She placed one in front of Margaret and the other across from her. "To new beginnings," Vanessa said, lifting her cup. Margaret nodded and picked up her own cup, but she didn't drink. She let the mug hover near her lips, inhaling the scent. It was off, slightly metallic. She glanced at Vanessa, whose eyes were locked on her, expectant. "I need to get something from the cabinet," Margaret said suddenly, standing up and walking toward the far end of the kitchen. As she passed behind Vanessa, she executed the switch, a quick, practiced sleight of hand that she never thought she'd use outside of her mystery literature lectures. The cups exchanged places effortlessly. When she returned, she lifted the cup to her lips and took a very small sip, just enough to maintain the illusion. Vanessa smiled and drank deeply from her own cup. It happened fast. A minute later, Vanessa dropped her cup, which shattered on the tile floor. She clutched her chest, then her stomach. Her breathing turned shallow, erratic, her eyes wide with confusion and pain. "Margaret, something's wrong," she gasped. Margaret stood calmly. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She reached for the phone on the wall and dialed 911. "Yes, I need an ambulance. My daughter-in-law collapsed. I believe she's having a seizure. Yes. The address is 412 Briarwood Lane. Please hurry." She hung up and returned to her seat. Vanessa was now lying on the floor, her body twitching, a trail of foam forming at the corners of her mouth. Margaret just watched. In her mind, images flickered of last Christmas, when Vanessa had told Lucas that his mother didn't need to live so close. Of the birthday dinner that Vanessa conveniently forgot. Of the times she turned Lucas against her, sowing doubt, making him believe his mother was manipulative, emotionally draining, bitter. All of it choreographed like a slow, cruel opera. Margaret had said nothing then, but she knew. She had always known. The sirens were faint in the distance when Margaret walked to the sink and found the small glass vial in the drain. She picked it up with a tissue and dropped it in a Ziploc bag before slipping it into a drawer, just in case. When the paramedics arrived, Margaret opened the door with perfect composure. She just collapsed. One moment she was fine. The next, please help her. They rushed in. No one questioned her calmness. Age often gave women the ability to suppress their panic, or at least, that was the polite assumption. As they wheeled Vanessa out, Margaret stood at the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Cora, turned to her. Do you know if she has any medical conditions? Allergies? Margaret looked past her, her eyes focused on the ambulance. None that I'm aware of, but I think she may have eaten something bad. Cora nodded. We'll run a tox screen. She's unresponsive right now, but we'll do what we can. When they drove away, Margaret returned inside, locked the door, and finally let her hand tremble. She walked over to the broken pieces of porcelain on the floor and began cleaning them slowly. Each shard carried the memory of what might have been her own death, but fate had drawn the line that morning, and Margaret, quiet, perceptive Margaret, had stepped back just far enough to see it. She rinsed the cloth under warm water, wrung it out, and wiped down the counter carefully. She poured out both cups of coffee, flushed the grounds, and washed the mugs. She didn't want the scent of death lingering in her kitchen. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat on her porch with a fresh cup of tea. No sugar, no cream, just bitter and honest, like the truth. She thought of Lucas and how this would reach him. Would he defend his wife? Would he believe his mother was capable of this? Would he think she'd gone mad? Possibly, but Margaret didn't care anymore, not the way she once did. For years, she had lived under the illusion that being silent was noble, that swallowing mistreatment was an act of grace, but grace had a limit, and today, that limit had been reached. She glanced up at the sky, where clouds were slowly curling above the town. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the roses she had trimmed the day before. She didn't regret it. Not the swap, not the calm, not the truth. Because something far worse than guilt lived in her home before this morning, and that was fear. And now, fear had collapsed on her kitchen floor and been wheeled away in a screaming ambulance. The sun dipped behind the trees as Margaret sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm in her hands, the silence deeper now, more honest. This was the first morning in years that her coffee hadn't tasted like caution, that tasted like survival. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Her eyes stayed open, even after hours of trying to let the darkness soothe her. Her room was dim, a soft amber glow from the hallway nightlights spilling across the floor. The events of the morning replayed in her head with the precision of a stage production, every detail, every glance, every instinct that had led her to switch the cups. If she had hesitated for even a second, her story would have ended on that cold kitchen tile. But it didn't. Instead, Vanessa lay in a hospital bed, unconscious, and Margaret was the one left behind to sift through the ashes. She rose just before dawn, wrapped herself in her old woolen shawl, and went into the garden. The dew was thick on the petals, and the grass was cold beneath her slippers. The chrysanthemums had started blooming early this year. Despite the cool weather, and Margaret found herself distracted by their defiance, they thrived quietly, stubbornly, much like she had all her life. She sat on the iron bench beside the hedge and waited for the phone to ring. It had been nearly 24 hours since the ambulance took Vanessa away. There had been no update, no call from Lucas, no word from the hospital. She wasn't surprised. Lucas hadn't called her on his own in months. Margaret had long suspected it was Vanessa who filtered every form of communication that came her way, selectively sharing, editing, or blocking entirely. She didn't want to call him. Not yet. Not until she was ready to tell him the truth. When she re-entered the house, she moved through the rooms with a mechanical rhythm, tidying things that were already tidy, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing. She placed the glass vial she had saved from the sink inside a small wooden box, along with some old photographs and documents she thought might come in handy. She had no idea if the police would believe her when the time came. That's the trouble. With quiet women, we are rarely believed when we finally speak. The knock at the door startled her. It was only 8 a.m. *. She walked to the front window and pulled the curtain slightly. A man stood there in a brown suit, holding a small notepad. His eyes scanned the porch, the garden, the street. Margaret opened the door just enough to be cautious. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Whitmore, the man asked politely. "Detective Elijah Crane, Fairhaven PD. May I have a moment?" She opened the door wider and gestured toward the sitting room. "Of course." He stepped inside, noting everything, with his eyes the gleaming floors, the books stacked neatly by the fireplace, the faint smell of lavender in the air. It was a home that looked lived in, loved, and very controlled. "Would you like coffee?" Margaret asked, a touch of irony curling in her voice. Crane chuckled. "No, thank you. I think I've had enough coffee for today." They both sat, and for a moment, silence filled the space between them. Vanessa Holloway is in intensive care at St. Catherine's. He began, flipping open his notepad. "She regained partial consciousness for a brief period last night, but she's not coherent yet." Margaret nodded once, her hands folded in her lap. "The doctors ran a tox screen. They found aconitine in her system, a plant-based poison. It's not something you just stumble into. It's extremely potent, usually used for deliberate poisoning." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. "I suspected something was wrong with the coffee. That's why I didn't drink it." He blinked. "You didn't drink it?" She shook her head. "I switched the cups when she wasn't looking. It felt wrong. Her tone, her sudden appearance, the way she insisted on preparing everything. I know Vanessa. I may not have had a good relationship with her, but I know when something is off." Crane leaned forward slightly. "Why do you think she'd want to poison you?" Margaret let out a breath, calm and steady. "Because she's been manipulating my son for years. Because I recently discovered discrepancies in financial records connected to my late husband's trust, which I suspect she forged. Because she's always seen me as an obstacle, and I think she was tired of me interfering." She stood and walked toward the hallway, returning with a small Ziploc bag containing the glass vial. She handed it to him. "I found this in the sink. She must have dropped it after she poured it in the cup." Crane examined it carefully. "You kept this quiet." "I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I wasn't even sure I'd be believed." He nodded. "Honestly, that was smart. You're lucky. Aconitine works fast." "I read about it once, in a book, a murder mystery, years ago." She offered a faint smile. "Funny how fiction sometimes prepares you better for life than reality does." He closed his notebook. "I'll need to take this vial into evidence. We'll also need a formal statement." "You'll have it," she said simply. After he left, Margaret sat back down and stared at the wall. The calm she had worn so well began to slip, just slightly. Her fingers trembled for a moment, not from fear, but from the weight of truth finally being spoken. For years, she had suspected Vanessa of cruelty, of small, calculated injuries, an extra word to Lucas, a deliberate exclusion from events, a financial decision made without consent. But this was murder, or would have been. She wondered what Lucas would say when he heard. Would he believe her? Or would he twist it around, as he always had, seeing only the veneer that Vanessa wore so well? The good wife, the charming professional, the woman who had given him a son. Margaret had loved Lucas more than anything. He had been a soft child, kind, thoughtful, with a love of books and his mother's garden. But somewhere between growing up and marrying Vanessa, that softness had hardened into something else, something distant, and Margaret had never quite been able to reach him again. That afternoon, the phone rang. She recognized the number. It was Lucas. She answered on the second ring. His voice was tight, controlled. "Yes, Lucas, they told me. About Vanessa, that she collapsed at your house, that the hospital found poison. Is this true?" "Yes," she said quietly. "She brought me coffee. I didn't drink it." "She did." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that vibrates with disbelief. "You're saying she tried to poison you?" "I'm saying I watched her pour something into my cup when she thought I wasn't looking. I'm saying I trusted my instincts, and I'm saying I gave the police the evidence." "You could be wrong. Maybe, she was set up." Margaret's voice softened, but didn't falter. "Lucas, how many times have I been wrong about Vanessa?" He didn't answer. Check the trust records, she continued. Go through the financials. Talk to Mr. Hargrove. Ask him about the recent attempts to access your father's accounts using my forged signature. Look at the pieces, Lucas. I'm not the enemy. Asterisk, I need time, he muttered. I can't believe this. Not yet. Asterisk, I know, she said. But you will. He hung up. Margaret stood by the window for the rest of the evening, watching the street below. A mother shouldn't have to defend her life to her own child. But this wasn't a story with heroes and villains. This was real, and in the real world, sometimes the people you love most are the ones who refuse to see the truth, even when it's clawing at the door. Asterisk, that night, she didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was clarity. Vanessa had tried to end her story, but what she hadn't realized was that Margaret was already writing a new one where she wasn't the victim in the shadows, but the author of her own survival. And this was just the beginning. The morning light filtered through the living room curtains as Margaret sat quietly at her writing desk. A place once dedicated to poetry, drafts, and letters, now transformed into an evidence board. The leather-bound notebook in front of her was filled not with verses, but with dates, patterns, bank account entries, and quiet suspicions long harbored in silence. She had spent the better part of the previous evening combing through everything, paper trails she once ignored, casual remarks that now echoed with sharp intent, and financial documents she had stored for years without realizing their full implications. Asterisk, Vanessa wasn't sloppy. She was calculated, meticulous, but even the most careful conspirators leave breadcrumbs. Asterisk, Margaret's fingers trailed over a folder labeled Lucas Trust. It contained original statements from the account set up by her late husband, the generous sum meant for their son and grandson. She compared them against recent copies obtained from Mr. Hargrove, her estate lawyer. There were discrepancies. Funds moved without authorization, withdrawals that Margaret had never approved, and most importantly, several digital access logs traced back to devices not registered in her name. Margaret couldn't prove it entirely yet, but she knew Vanessa had been dipping into the trust fund, forging approvals, and disguising her actions under Lucas's name. Asterisk, the sound of a car door outside interrupted her thoughts. She stood, brushed the wrinkles from her blouse, and moved to the window. A familiar silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Detective Elijah Crane stepped out, carrying a laptop bag and what appeared to be a small case file. Asterisk, she opened the door. Before he knocked, asterisk, you're early, she said with a thin smile. Asterisk, thought I'd save us both some time, Crane replied, stepping inside. I had a few things I wanted to go over with you in person. Asterisk, they returned to the sitting room, where the scent of jasmine from her garden lingered. Crane placed the case file on the table and opened it. Inside were printed screenshots, bank transactions, login timestamps, and 2 email correspondences. Asterisk, we got a warrant for her devices, he began. The IT team pulled data from her laptop and her cloud backups. What we found confirms your suspicions. Access to your trust was made from her personal device. She used a document scanning app to digitally replicate your signature. Pretty convincing, actually. Asterisk, Margaret stayed still, but her fingers curled into her palm. Asterisk, she also sent the message a week ago to someone listed as J. Handler. That's a name we're still digging into, likely a financial advisor or a shell contact. The email said, funds will be cleared by Friday. She won't be an issue anymore. Crane let that sentence linger between them. Margaret repeated quietly. Asterisk, Crane nodded. We believe that's you. Of course it is, she said. He took out another sheet from the file. There's one more thing. We found a search history entry on aconitinid's symptoms, dosage, how to mask the taste. She'd been researching it for weeks. Asterisk, Margaret exhaled, her chest rising slowly. What happens now? Asterisk, we're building the case. As soon as she regains full consciousness, we'll have probable cause to arrest her. Given the attempted murder charge, financial fraud, and the intent established in her digital records, this won't take long. The prosecution's eager. Asterisk, Margaret looked at the coffee table where an untouched cup of tea sat cooling. Her own reflection stared back at her in the surface. She didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. There was still a dull ache behind her ribs. The sort of ache that comes from betrayal long simmering beneath the surface. Asterisk, I've been asking myself, she said suddenly. Why now? Why kill me now? She's hated me for years. Asterisk, Crane leaned back slightly. Maybe she thought it was the perfect time. Your health's been stable. Your affairs recently updated. And Lucas, well, she's had his loyalty for a while now. From where she stood, maybe it looked like you were finally vulnerable. Margaret nodded. That was the worst part, not the attempt itself, but how justified Vanessa must have felt in doing it. In her mind, Margaret was expendable. Just a name to cross off, a final obstacle. After Crane left, Margaret sat alone for a long time, staring at the old family photos on the mantel. One in particular held her attention, a picture from 10 years ago, Christmas morning. Lucas had his arm around Vanessa, both of them smiling broadly. Margaret had just gifted Lucas an antique watch, one that belonged to his grandfather. In the photo, Vanessa's smile was gracious, but her eyes weren't. They had that same calculating gleam she always wore when she was pretending to care. Margaret picked up the photo frame and gently turned it around. Taped to the back was a torn piece of paper. She had scribbled a note that day, just a simple observation she didn't want to forget. She watched me before I handed him the watch. Even then, there had been signs. Margaret felt the surge of old Shamha. Many times she had chosen peace over confrontation, silence over suspicion, for the sake of Lucas. All those years of denying her instincts, of suppressing discomfort, of telling herself she was being paranoid or difficult, but the truth had always been there. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. Can I come over later today? We need to talk. Margaret stared at the message, reading it twice, 3 times. Her thumb hovered over the reply button before she finally typed back, yes, doors open. He arrived around 6 p.m. His face tired, his eyes strained with the weight of disbelief. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if unsure how to step back into his mother's home after what had transpired. Margaret motioned for him to sit. Lucas sat on the same couch his father once napped on after Sunday dinners. He looked around the house with a strange mixture of familiarity and guilt. I went through the files you sent me, he said quietly. I called Mr. Hargrove. I saw the access logs, and I read the emails. Margaret didn't speak. I didn't want to believe it, he continued. I didn't want to think the woman I married could do something like this. But the signs were always there, weren't they? Margaret's voice was calm, but firm. You wanted to believe the story she told you, that I was jealous, controlling, that I didn't want you to be happy. You chose her version because it was easier than asking questions. Lucas flinched slightly. I'm sorry. That's not enough, she said, her voice harder now. You let her come between us. You let her isolate me, and now she tried to kill me. His eyes reddened. I should have seen it. You didn't want to see it, she interrupted, because if you had, you would have had to admit you married someone who doesn't love you, someone who only saw you as a gateway to money, control, and power. Lucas looked down, ashamed. What happens now? She be arrested. There will be a trial, and your son will need to know the truth about his mother, eventually. I don't know how to do that, he whispered. You start by being honest, Margaret said. And you stop pretending that silence is love. They sat in silence. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like she was fighting to be heard. She had spoken, and her son had listened fully, not yet. But enough, as the sun dipped below the trees outside, casting long shadows across the room. Lucas stood. I'll be back, he said. Jamie wants to visit you this weekend. Margaret nodded. I'd like that. When the door closed behind him, Margaret finally allowed herself a small exhale. It wasn't closure, but it was movement, and after years of emotional paralysis, that was enough. She returned to her desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and began writing not notes, not facts or records this time, but the beginnings of a new journal entry. Not about death, but about rebirth. A story she would write in her own words, in her own time, and this time, no one else would hold the pen. The day after Lucas's visit, Margaret awoke with a heaviness in her chest that no cup of tea or soft sunrise could wash away. There was no comfort in being right, not when the truth was sharp and bleeding. She sat at her bedroom window for a long while, watching the neighbor's sprinkler mist the garden across the street, trying to make sense of the odd mixture of relief and grief sitting inside her. She had escaped death, uncovered betrayal, and brought her son face to face with the reality he had spent years avoiding, but none of it felt victorious. There was no justice in watching your child unravel. Later that morning, she pulled out an old wooden chest from the back of her closet, one she hadn't opened in nearly a decade. Inside were photos, letters, and fragments of a life once filled with warmth. She lifted a faded envelope marked Lucas's college graduation and smiled. Inside was a note she had written on the day he earned his degree, her handwriting crisp, unshaken. "You have made me proud in ways I can never explain. Never forget who you are, even if the world tries to make you forget me." She closed the lid gently and stood. She needed to visit the one place she had avoided for far too long, Lucas and Vanessa's home. Not for confrontation, not for rage, but to face the shadows that had been festering there in silence. It was time to look the past directly in the eye. She called Lucas first. He didn't hesitate. "I'll be home in an hour," he said. "Do you want me there?" "No," Margaret replied. "This is something I need to see for myself." The drive to their house was short, but each passing street felt like peeling away another layer of history. The Holloway residence sat on a quiet, tree-lined street in the more affluent part of Fairhaven. It was elegant, symmetrical, and sterile, in the way houses often are when love has been replaced by performance. She parked by the curb and walked up the stone pathway, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in her ears. With the spare key Lucas had left in her mailbox the night before, she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was painfully clean, not a pillow out of place or frame crooked. Margaret moved through the rooms slowly, noting the decor, tasteful, minimalistic, curated by someone more concerned with appearances than comfort. Vanessa's presence was etched into every detail. The books on the shelf were arranged by color, not subject. The kitchen counters were spotless, almost unused. Even the family photos felt staged, capturing hollow smiles under perfect lighting. But the study was different. Lucas's office, tucked into the far end of the hallway, was cluttered in a way that felt real: papers, dog-eared books, a crooked painting his son Jamie had made in kindergarten. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame, letting the familiarity of her son's space ground her. Then she saw a manila folder poking out from under a stack of bills on the desk. Curiosity got the better of her. She opened it. Inside were printed emails between Vanessa and someone named Gregory Vance. Margaret didn't recognize the name, but the subject lines chilled her. Subject: access to account number 47,900. Update. Subject: Margaret Whitmore. Signature template. Enclosed. Subject: secure file. Delete. After reading, she sat down slowly. Scanning through the emails, they detailed plans to redirect funds, requests for login credentials, and even inquiries about non-traceable cash transfers. One message stood out. She's stubborn. Lucas still buys her act, but I can't risk her uncovering this. I'm handling it. Once she's gone, we can finalize everything. Margaret swallowed hard. So this wasn't just manipulation. It was premeditated, cold, strategic. Vanessa hadn't been operating alone. There were others involved, and she had planned every step like a chess move. She gathered the papers and carefully tucked them into her handbag. Just then, a sound startled her, a small knock at the glass door to the patio. It was Jamie. The boy stood there with a juice box in hand, his face brightening when he saw her. Margaret's heart softened immediately. She walked over and opened the door. Nana, he exclaimed, wrapping his small arms around her waist. Jamie, sweetheart, she said, kneeling to meet him. What are you doing here? Daddy dropped me off at Mrs. Lawson's, but I saw your car. I wanted to say hi. She smiled and brushed a curl from his forehead. I'm so happy to see you. Jamie stepped inside, looking around. Where's Mommy? Margaret hesitated. She's at the hospital, remember. She's a little sick. Daddy said she was poisoned. Jamie said innocently. Margaret's breath caught, but she didn't flinch. That's something the doctors are figuring out. For now, she's resting. Jamie nodded, already distracted by a toy on the floor. Margaret watched him with a strange eye. This boy, caught in the middle of an adult storm he couldn't comprehend, his innocence still intact. For how long? Jamie, she said gently. Do you remember anything your mommy said before she got sick? Anything unusual? Asterisk, he looked up, thoughtful. She was mad a lot. She'd whisper in the kitchen. Sometimes I heard her say your name. She said you were old and had lived long enough. The words hit like a knife. Margaret's eyes welled up, but she blinked the tears away. You're very smart, Jamie, and very brave. Asterisk, Lucas arrived shortly after, his face drawn, his eyes tired. I shouldn't have brought him here, he said quickly. It's okay, Margaret replied. He didn't hear anything he shouldn't. Asterisk, Lucas looked at her bag. You found something, didn't you? Asterisk, she nodded. Emails. From Vanessa, to someone named Gregory Vance. She was coordinating the transfers, planning my removal. It's all there. Asterisk, Lucas ran a hand through his hair. God. It's worse than I thought. Asterisk, I'm going to give it to the detective. This adds another layer to the case. Asterisk, he nodded, then glanced toward Jamie, who was playing with blocks on the floor. What do I even tell him? Asterisk, that his mother is sick, and that it's not his fault. Asterisk, Lucas looked down. Do you hate me? Asterisk, Margaret's eyes softened. I could never hate you, but I hated who you became under her shadow. Asterisk, I was blind. Asterisk, you were afraid of being wrong, of losing the life you thought you were building. Asterisk, Lucas sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. She destroyed everything. Asterisk, no, Margaret said. She tried, but you can still fix what's left. Start with your son. Show him what honesty looks like. Asterisk, they sat in silence as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the room. Jamie came over and curled into Margaret's side, resting his head against her arm. I missed you, Nana, he murmured. I missed you too, sweetheart. Asterisk, Margaret looked out at the horizon, knowing that the real storm hadn't passed yet. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone in it. Lucas was waking up. Jamie was still pure, and the truth was no longer hidden behind smiles and silence. She would face what came next, not with fear, but with clarity. Margaret stood by the window in her kitchen, watching as early autumn wind rustled the trees outside. The leaves, still clinging to the last shades of green, were beginning to turn. Change was coming, slow and certain, much like the one that had taken root in her own life. She sipped her tea slowly, the warmth calming her hands but doing little for the unrest in her mind. She knew what she had to do today. It was the day she would meet Mr. Hargrove, her longtime estate lawyer, to finalize adjustments to her will that had once felt like a formality but now felt like survival. Asterisk, the drive to Hargrove and Lane Legal Services was quiet. She didn't play the radio. Instead, she rehearsed the things she would ask, the protections she needed to ensure would stay in place. The building was an old red brick structure near the city courthouse. Ivy crawling up the sides like age creeping across time. Asterisk, Mr. Hargrove greeted her personally at the door, as he always did. A tall, wiry man in his 70s, with silver hair, combed neatly and eyes that always held a mixture of intelligence and sympathy. Asterisk, Margaret, he said with a gentle nod. I was expecting you. Come in. Asterisk, she followed him into his office, where thick curtains muffled the city sounds and the scent of old books hung in the air. She sat across from him at the oak desk that had likely seen decades of secrets, last wishes, and legal defenses. Asterisk, you received my message, she asked, pulling a leather folder from her handbag. Asterisk, I did, he replied, and after everything I've read, I believe we should strengthen what you've already put in place. I'm assuming you're referring to the trust for Jamie. Asterisk, yes, she said. I want it locked airtight. If anything happens to me, I don't want Luchasaur, anyone else, allowing Vanessa access. I don't care if she walks out of that hospital claiming amnesia. She does not touch a cent. Asterisk, Mr. Hargrove nodded and pulled out a large binder. You were wise to revise your estate plan last year. It already stipulates that Vanessa is excluded from inheritance. However, we can add a final provision, a clause that explicitly voids her eligibility in any scenario, including mental manipulation or undue influence claims. Do it, Margaret said without hesitation. He made notes, flipping through pages with practiced ease. And the house. Asterisk, I want it to go to Jamie, not Lucas, not as an inherited property, but placed in a minor's trust. He can't sell it, can't transfer it, and it should be managed by a third-party fiduciary, not Lucas. Very protective, he noted. I have to be, she said. You've seen the emails. You know what she was capable of. Asterisk, I do, he replied, and I've already sent copies of those documents too. Detective Crane. They've been entered as supplemental evidence in the case. She'll be facing multiple felony charges: attempted murder, wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. It's serious. Margaret stared out the window. She almost killed me over money. Most do, Hardgrove said grimly, but you outmaneuvered her. Not many people can say that. Margaret didn't smile. There was no pleasure in surviving a murder attempt by someone you once considered family. After they completed the paperwork, Mr. Hargrove handed her a sealed envelope. This is your updated will, he said. You'll get the notarized copies in the mail. Keep one safe, and give a copy to someone you trust. She took it, tucking it into her bag. I trust myself. As she left the office, the wind had picked up, tossing leaves across the parking lot in chaotic spirals. She stood by her car for a long moment, breathing in the scent of coming rain. It reminded her of the day her husband died. Lucas had been just a teenager then, and Vanessa was only a new name in his friend circle. Back then, Margaret never would have imagined the trajectory their lives would take. That evening, back at home, she sat in her study and pulled out an old wooden box with brass corners. Inside were trinkets, memories of a life before things turned sour, letters from her husband, a charm bracelet Lucas made in elementary school, and a yellowing photo of the three of them smiling in front of a Christmas tree. Vanessa wasn't in it. That was a time before her, a time when the house was filled with laughter, not caution. Margaret lit a candle and placed it by the window. A ritual she used to do every Sunday night for peace and clarity. It was something her mother had passed down to her, a small act of defiance against chaos. Tonight, it felt especially needed. She had just begun preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. It was Lucas. He stood there, not as a broken man or a child seeking comfort, but with a different look in his eyes, one of responsibility. I signed the paperwork, he said. Custodial rights for Jamie. In case anything happens to me, you'll have primary guardianship. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. You did that. He nodded. You were right. I've been blind for too long. I let her push you out of my life, out of Jamie's life. I thought I was protecting my family by keeping peace, but really, I was just giving her the stage. They walked into the living room and sat beside the fire. Jamie, sleeping upstairs, having come over after school. I always thought she loved me, Lucas admitted, but now I wonder if she ever did. She loved control, Margaret replied, and she used your love to get it. I didn't see it. Because you didn't want to. He nodded slowly. The detective told me she likely faced a trial in a few months. They'll make it public. Margaret sipped her tea, then let it be public. Let people know what charm can hide. Lucas looked at her, regret flooding his face. I let you walk alone for too long. And I survived, she said. But I shouldn't have had to. Lucas took her hand, for the first time in years. Can we fix this? Margaret studied his tired face. The line stress had etched along his brow, the shadow of pain still clinging to his voice. Yes, she said, but not all at once. And not if you're still waiting for someone else to make it better. I'm not, he whispered. Not anymore. She didn't forgive him all the way in that moment, but she softened, because sometimes healing didn't come in thunderclaps or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it came in slow, aching silences, where two people decided to sit through the discomfort together. They talked late into the evening about Jamie, about the upcoming trial, about Margaret's new will. Lucas didn't argue. He didn't complain. He just listened, really listened, for what felt like the first time in years. When he left, Margaret walked him to the door and watched as he disappeared into the night. The wind had died down, and the world felt a little less heavy. She turned off the lights, climbed the stairs, and paused outside Jamie's door. She opened it gently and stepped inside. He lay curled beneath the covers, his small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Margaret bent down, brushed his hair back, and kissed his forehead. You're safe, she whispered. No matter what. She returned to her bedroom, her heart full of quiet ache, but also something unexpected hope. Not a loud blazing hope, but a small ember nestled in the ash. Something still alive. As she slipped under the covers, she didn't fear the morning. She had rewritten her ending, and this time, she wasn't going anywhere. The air felt thick with memory as Margaret moved through her house the next morning. Everything had weight, every glance at the window, every creak of the wooden floorboards, every breath she took while standing still. Though the days had passed since Vanessa's collapse, the lingering scent of near-death still clung to the quiet corners of her life. Yet strangely, what stirred now wasn't fear, it was a grief, not for herself, but for everything that had already died long before the poisoned coffee was ever poured. After her confrontation with Vanessa at the hospital, Margaret found herself more hollowed than victorious. The moment had not brought closure. It had not undone years of betrayal. If anything, it reopened old wounds, and some wounds bleed only when they're finally acknowledged. She spent most of that morning in her garden, pruning the dying blooms, watering the roots that had held on through the long, dry summer. The chrysanthemums, resilient and stubborn, had started to bloom once more. Their return felt like a whisper from the universe. Even those who are neglected can come back to life. Lucas arrived later in the afternoon. This time, he didn't knock. He let himself in using the key she had hidden behind the third brick on the porch, something only he and his father had ever known. It felt symbolic, that gesture, a small reclaiming of their bond. Margaret met him in the hallway. "Hey," he said simply. Hey. There was a long pause before Lucas stepped forward and pulled her into an embrace. Not a quick, perfunctory one, but something deeper. His arms wrapped around her the way he hadn't since he was a boy scared of thunderstorms. "I needed to see you," he murmured. She stepped back slightly and studied him. "Are you okay?" He shook his head. "No, not really, but I'm trying." They moved into the kitchen. She poured him tea, and they sat at the table with the late daylight slanting through the blinds. There were no scripts left between them, no pretenses to uphold. "I've been going through Vanessa's files," Lucas said, "even the ones she tried to hide. You were right. She forged your signature on multiple documents. She had offshore transfers, emails to people I don't recognize. She was planning this for a while." Margaret didn't blink. "I know." She kept a notebook. Lucas continued, "Encrypted on her computer. Took me hours to get in. There were notes about your routines, your morning walks, what time you usually made coffee, even references to medication, how you reacted to over-the-counter pills. She was studying you." Margaret gripped her mug a little tighter. "That doesn't surprise me." He looked up, pain cutting across his face. "How did I not see it? How did I let her turn me against you?" "Because you loved her," Margaret said softly. "And you wanted to believe she loved you." Lucas looked down at the table. "I'm so sorry." "I know you are," she replied, "but I need you to understand something. You weren't just a husband, Lucas. You were a son. And when you cut me out of your life, that left scars I didn't know how to speak of." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I see that now." They sat in silence for a long time, letting the weight of unspoken words finally settle where they belonged. Sometimes, healing wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was found in the quiet willingness to stay. Jamie's been asking questions. Lucas finally said, "He wants to know why he can't visit Mommy." Margaret's heart twisted. "What did you tell him?" That she's sick, that she's resting, that she needs time. She nodded. "That's the truth. In a way, I don't know how to tell him more than that," Lucas confessed. "How do you explain to a child that someone who tucks you in at night is also capable of cruelty?" Margaret took a deep breath. "You don't explain it all at once. You show him, over time, what kindness looks like, what love feels like. You rebuild the world around him so that he knows what safety means, again." Lucas rested his hand on hers. "Can you help me do that?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Later that evening, after Lucas had left to pick up Jamie, Margaret went upstairs to her study. She opened the bottom drawer of her writing desk and pulled out an old leather journal. It was nearly full, pages upon pages of reflections, poetry, and letters never sent. She turned to a blank page and began to write not a letter this time, but a record of the moment. Today, my son returned to me not in grand apologies, but in the trembling confession of his absence. He walked back into the garden of our bond with calloused hands and a heart too heavy to carry alone. And I took some of the weight because that's what mothers do. Even when they're tired, even when they've bled, they carry what others can't. And they do it in silence until someone finally notices. The next morning, Jamie came over. He ran into the house with the kind of energy only children possess, his backpack bouncing behind him, and his hands filled with crayon drawings. Nana, I drew this for you. Margaret knelt down and took the picture. It was a colorful sketch of a house with 3 figures in front of it, Jamie, Lucas, and herself. They were smiling under a bright sun. Vanessa was not in the picture. It's beautiful, she said, hugging him tightly. I'll put it on the fridge, he beamed. Daddy says I can stay for the weekend. Margaret glanced at Lucas, who had followed behind. If that's okay, he said gently. Of course it is. They spent the day baking cookies, playing board games, and reading stories on the porch swing. Jamie fell asleep in her arms before dinner, curled against her side like he had never known any world but this one. Margaret carried him upstairs and tucked him into the guest bed. She lingered at the doorway for a long moment, watching his soft, steady breathing. This was what mattered. Not the money, not the estate, not even the justice that would be served in court. This, the boy who still believed in love. She returned downstairs and found Lucas in the kitchen, wiping down the counter. Vanessa's lawyer called. He said suddenly, she's hiring private counsel. They're going to try to claim diminished capacity, that the poisoning was accidental, that she was mentally unwell. Margaret wasn't surprised. They'll say anything to lessen the sentence. She wants to talk to me, he added. Margaret's stomach sank. Are you going to see her? I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants answers. The other part, I'm afraid of what she'll say, that she'll twist everything again. She will, Margaret said. But you don't owe her anything. Not after what she's done. Lucas nodded slowly. You're right. I just keep thinking, how do you let go of someone who was your entire life for a decade? You don't let go all at once, she said. You let go every day, in small pieces, until one day, you wake up and the ache isn't the first thing you feel anymore. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes was a quiet reverence. I'm lucky you didn't give up on me. I almost did, she admitted, but I never stopped loving you. He stepped forward and kissed her forehead, something he hadn't done in years. I'll see you in the morning, he said, before heading out the door. Margaret stood there for a long time, alone in the kitchen, her reflection wavering in the window as the night deepened. The house was still, but no longer haunted. It breathed again. It lived again. Upstairs, Jamie slept without fear. Outside, the chrysanthemums glowed softly under the moonlight. And in that moment, Margaret realized something that had escaped her for years. She wasn't broken. She was becoming. The air in Margaret's home had grown noticeably lighter in the days since. Lucas's quiet return and Jamie's laughter filled the halls. The weight of unspoken things was still there gently, folded in corners, tucked into drawer spaces where old memories lived, but it no longer pressed against her chest like it once had. She could breathe now. Even if the storm hadn't passed completely, she had found the eye of it, and in that center, there was peace. It was a Tuesday morning when she received the email. The subject line read, Evidence File Recovered. Vanessa Holloway. The sender was Detective Elijah Crane. She opened it slowly, hand steady despite the gravity of what she expected to see. The body of the message was brief. Margaret, the forensics team recovered a deleted audio recording from Vanessa's phone backups. It may be difficult to listen to, but we believe it supports your claims. File attached for your records. The prosecution has already been notified. Attached was an audio file titled Voice Memo Confession 729. Margaret clicked play. The voice was unmistakable. Vanessa. Her tone was soft, almost casual, as if she were rehearsing aloud for herself, crafting a plan, perfecting a narrative. But beneath the calmness was something else. Calculation. Ice. Margaret's too sharp. It's annoying. She watches everything, notices the smallest things. I think she suspects already. Lucas is blind. Still thinks she's some wounded saint. I just need to get through this one last step. Once she's gone, the trust opens up. Lucas won't ask questions once he believes it was her own carelessness. The aconitine works fast. One sip. That's all. One sip. The recording ended. Margaret sat frozen. The sunlight streaming through the window suddenly felt too bright, too intrusive. There was no longer any space for doubt. Vanessa hadn't been impulsive. She hadn't snapped out of desperation. This was premeditated, cold-blooded, meticulously scripted. She forwarded the audio to her estate lawyer and Detective Crane, then shut her laptop. For several minutes, she didn't move. Her heart beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, not fear, but something deeper, a resolve that had sharpened into steel. Vanessa would never harm her again. That evening, Lucas stopped by. He brought flowers, daisies, her favorite, which she hadn't mentioned in over a decade. Margaret noticed the care in the gesture and smiled as she placed them in a ceramic vase she'd once made in a pottery class with his father. You look like you've been through something, he said as he settled onto the couch. I heard the recording, she replied, handing him a printout of the transcription. Lucas read in silence. His lips thinned. His face didn't move, but his hands trembled. She really said this, he whispered. She meant every word. He closed his eyes. I feel like I'm grieving a death that hasn't happened yet. You are, Margaret said. You're grieving who you thought she was. I keep wondering what part of our life was real. Were there ever real moments? Or was it all performance? Margaret shook her head gently. Even liars have truths. She may have loved you, in her own way. But it wasn't the kind of love that protects. It was the kind that consumes. Lucas leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She wanted you dead. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth was loud enough. She's going to jail, he added. There's no denying it now. Yes, Margaret said quietly, but before that, she tried to manipulate everyone again. Pled mental illness. Talk about her upbringing. Paint herself as a victim. People like her never go quietly. Lucas nodded. She called me. Margaret's brows rose. She left a voicemail, said she needed to see me, that she had things to explain. Are you going? I don't know. Margaret paused, then reached for his hand. If you do, go not as her husband, but as Jamie's father. You owe her no understanding, but you owe your son the truth. I'm scared, Lucas said, voice barely audible, that I'll see her and fall under it again, that I'll hear her cry and want to believe her. Then, don't go alone. The next morning, Lucas made the decision to visit Vanessa at the hospital. He asked Margaret to come with him, not into the room, but to wait outside. He needed an anchor, and for the first time in years, he trusted her to be that. They arrived at St. Catherine's just before noon. Vanessa had been moved from ICU to a private room under guard. The legal proceedings had begun, the charges filed, a court date set, but she was still a woman in recovery, still in a bed with flowers from old colleagues and a polished lawyer sitting quietly in the corner, like a sentinel. Margaret sat outside the room, in a plastic chair next to a vending machine, her hands folded over her purse. She could see Lucas through the window. Vanessa looked thinner, paler, her eyes sunken, but the moment she saw Lucas, her entire demeanor shifted. Her face lit up. She reached for him. Margaret watched her mouth move. Lucas didn't take her hand. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When Lucas stepped out, his face was unreadable. Did she confess? Margaret asked. Lucas nodded. Not outright. She spun stories, said she was confused, under stress. She cried. She said she was scared of losing everything, but then she said the word conatine. She knew exactly what she used. I didn't prompt her. She said it. That's enough, Margaret said. I didn't believe her tears, he whispered. For the first time, I saw her not as my wife, but as the woman who planned to kill my mother. He slumped into the chair beside her. I'm exhausted. You're free, Margaret corrected gently. When they returned home, Jamie ran out to meet them in the driveway. He clung to Lucas's waist, then to Margaret's hand. Nana, I drew a new rocket. Let me see. She smiled, her heart pulling upward. Asterisk, they followed him inside, where crayons and construction paper were scattered across the dining table. His drawing was a wild burst of color, and hope a spaceship shooting toward a sky of stars, leaving behind earthbound shadows. Asterisk, Margaret looked at it and saw more than just a child's imagination. She saw a future. That night, while Jamie slept soundly in the guest room and Lucas sat on the porch with a glass of wine, Margaret retreated to her study. She opened her journal again, the one she'd been filling since the day Vanessa fell to the floor of her kitchen. Asterisk, there is power in truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Today, my son stood in the lion's den and did not kneel. He looked at the woman who deceived him in the eye and did not flinch. That is a kind of bravery to quiet, desperate, redemptive. Asterisk, she closed the journal gently, placed it in the drawer, and turned off the light. Asterisk, as she lay in bed that evening, the wind brushing softly against the windows, Margaret felt something strange in her chest, a fullness. Not joy, not yet, but not pain either. It was resilience, finally settling into place, and it felt like coming home. Asterisk, the rain began just before dawn, gentle at first, like a whisper on the rooftops, then heavier, more deliberate, soaking the quiet streets of Fairhaven. Margaret watched it from her bedroom window, arms folded, her breath clouding the glass. It had been weeks since Vanessa's poisoning attempt, and now the ripples of that day were reaching shore. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for tomorrow. The trial would follow in a month, but today, something else stirred in the atmosphere. Something more personal, more final. Asterisk, Vanessa was awake, alert, and under house arrest with round-the-clock medical supervision. Her legal team had succeeded in arguing that her fragile health required a non-custodial holding for now, but with the mounting digital evidence, the audio confession, and Lucas's eyewitness testimony, her fate was virtually sealed. The prosecution was confident. Vanessa's carefully constructed world had crumbled, and yet, in the ruins, she clung to one final thread, her story. Asterisk, that morning, Margaret received a letter. Asterisk, it wasn't from a lawyer or a detective. It was handwritten in looping cursive on cream stationery, delivered by courier, no return address, but Margaret knew the handwriting well. She had seen it scribbled on birthday cards and dry-cleaning notes for over a decade. Asterisk, Vanessa. Asterisk, she sat down at the kitchen table, steam rising from her tea, and unfolded the letter with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. Margaret. Asterisk, by the time you read this, I'll have already asked Lucas for one final visit. I don't know if he'll come, but I hope you will. Asterisk, I have no excuses left. No tears to weaponize. No more stories to bend around your spine like a snake looking for warmth. I won't insult you by pretending I was sick when I did what I did. I was fully conscious, calculated, cold. Asterisk, but there's something I need to say before it's all over. Something you deserve to hear from my mouth, not from lawyers, judges, or newspaper columns. You gave me a family I didn't deserve. You gave me space I never earned, and I took it all and tried to erase you. I failed. I don't ask for forgiveness, only a conversation. If you come, come alone. Vanessa. Margaret sat still for a long while. She reread the letter twice. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, but there was something hollow in the words, a crack in the carefully constructed armor Vanessa had always worn. A vulnerability, perhaps genuine, or perhaps just another tactic. Margaret couldn't be sure. But she would go, not for Vanessa, asterisk, for herself. Asterisk, at noon, she arrived at the facility where Vanessa was being monitored, a private residence leased temporarily by her legal team, outfitted with medical staff, surveillance, and guards. As Margaret stepped out of her car, umbrella in hand, the air smelled of wet pavement and wilted roses. The world looked washed, as if something old had been rinsed away. Asterisk, a nurse opened the front door. She's expecting you. Asterisk, Margaret entered and was led to a quiet room at the back of the house. The curtains were drawn, and the air was heavy with antiseptic and lavender. Asterisk, Vanessa sat propped up in bed, her hair tied back, her complexion pale but lucid. No makeup, no jewelry, no designer pretense. Just a woman, stripped of control, tethered by her own consequences. You came, Vanessa said, her voice weak but clear. Margaret took the chair across from her. I did. A pause. I wasn't sure you would, Vanessa continued, but I hoped you would. Asterisk, Margaret folded her hands in her lap. Why? Asterisk, because I wanted to see the woman I tried to erase. Vanessa smiled faintly, and failed. Asterisk gaze didn't shift. You didn't just try to erase me. You tried to end me. Asterisk Vanessa nodded. Yes. Asterisk I want to know why, Margaret said. Not the story, not the act. The reason. Asterisk Vanessa looked down at her frail hands. Because I was angry. Because I spent my entire life believing that power meant never being vulnerable. And you, your grace, your silence, it terrified me. You didn't fight me. You didn't try to prove anything. You just stood there, always composed, always still, and that made me feel invisible. Asterisk Margaret raised an eyebrow. So you tried to kill me? To feel seen? Asterisk no, Vanessa replied. I tried to kill you because I thought I'd already gotten away with everything else. You were the last thread in a web I wanted to cut clean. Asterisk Margaret shook her head slowly, and yet here I am. Asterisk Vanessa let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Yes, you are. Another pause. I always envied the way Lucas loved you, Vanessa said quietly. Even when I turned him against you, it never disappeared. I saw it when he brought Jamie here. I saw it when he looked at you after the truth came out. Asterisk Margaret studied her. He loved you too, for a long time. But you didn't know what to do with love, did you? Asterisk no, Vanessa whispered. I thought love was a lever, something you pull when you need someone to stay. Asterisk Margaret stood, slowly, her voice even. You used everyone who ever gave you trust. You stole, manipulated, and lied. But the worst thing you ever did wasn't to me. Vanessa looked up, confused. You robbed your son of his innocence. You took away his sense of security. One day, Jamie will ask where his mother went, why she disappeared, and what do you expect me to say? Vanessa didn't answer. I will not lie to him, Margaret said. I will not let him grow up in a fairy tale designed to protect your reputation. Asterisk I wouldn't expect you to, Vanessa said softly. Just tell him that I didn't know how to love. But I tried. Margaret turned to leave. Margaret, Vanessa called after her. Asterisk she paused, hand on the doorknob. Asterisk do you think I was born like this? Or do you think the world made me this way? Asterisk Margaret didn't turn around. Her voice was firm but kind. I think you chose it, every day. Even when the world gave you a way out. And then she left. The sky had cleared when Margaret stepped outside. The rain had stopped, and sunlight danced across the wet leaves, painting the world in reflections. She walked to her car slowly, breathing in the scent of petrichor and redemption. Asterisk that evening, she sat on the porch with Jamie curled beside her. He was drawing again this time, a picture of a family holding hands under a large oak tree. It had 4 figures, him, his father, his nana, and a dog he insisted they'd get one day. Vanessa was not in the picture. Why didn't you draw your mummy? Margaret asked gently. Asterisk, Jamie looked up. Because she's gone. Daddy said she's somewhere resting. Asterisk, Margaret nodded. That's true, but you can still remember her if you want to. Asterisk, I don't really remember much, Jamie said. Only that she always looked busy. Asterisk Margaret hugged him close. You won't ever feel like you're in the way. I promise. Asterisk, he smiled, resting his head on her shoulder. Asterisk Lucas came out a moment later, carrying 3 mugs of warm cocoa. Asterisk, she asked about you, he said to Margaret, handing her a cup. Asterisk, I know, she said, sipping slowly. Asterisk, what did you say to her? Asterisk, enough. Asterisk Lucas sat down, his eyes scanning the horizon. She's going away for a long time. Asterisk, I hope she finds something worth saving in there. You're kinder than I am, he said. No, Margaret replied. Just older. Asterisk, they sat there for a while, the 3 of them, wrapped in a quiet that wasn't born of avoidance, but of peace. The sun dipped low, setting the world aflame in gold and crimson. Jamie dozed off in her lap, his small hand clutching hers. Asterisk 4, the first time in a long, long while. Margaret felt full. Asterisk she had walked through betrayal, outlived an attempted murder, and unearthed truths long buried. But more than that, she had reclaimed her story not as a victim, but as a survivor, a mother, a woman whose silence had never been weakness, only waiting. And now, the waiting was over. The morning of the trial dawned bright and indifferent. The sky an endless canvas of soft blue, pierced only by streaks of ivory clouds. Margaret stood in front of the mirror, fastening the delicate silver locket her late husband had gifted her many years ago. Her hands, though older now, still moved with purpose. This wasn't about vanity. It was about resolve. She wore a simple navy dress and her favorite gray shawl. Nothing flashy, just enough to show she hadn't been broken. She looked into her own eyes for a long moment. There was no fear left in them, no hesitation, only clarity. And beneath that clarity, something stronger, peace. Downstairs. Jamie was coloring at the dining table while Lucas packed a small lunchbox for him. He would be spending the day at Margaret's friend Helen's house, someone he loved, someone who would distract him with board games and home-baked cookies. Are you sure you're okay with him staying there all day? Lucas asked, handing Margaret Jamie's backpack. She nodded. He'll be fine. He doesn't need to be anywhere near this. Lucas looked at her, concern written into the furrow of his brow. And you? I've been near this my whole life. Today, I just get to tell the truth. They arrived at the courthouse just before 10. The old brick building stood solemn against the morning light, its age lending it a kind of dignity. Reporters were gathered outside, nothing overwhelming. Just a handful of local journalists and a few true crime bloggers who had picked up the story. The case had garnered attention for its unusual combination of scandal, betrayal, and attempted murder nestled within a seemingly picture-perfect family. Vanessa Holloway had once been seen as a community role model, charismatic, articulate, a generous donor at fundraisers. Now she was the defendant in a courtroom filled with former friends who no longer knew how to look her in the eye. Inside, Margaret took her seat near the front. Lucas sat beside her. The air in the courtroom was cool, too sterile, like the kind meant to preserve composure. But Margaret didn't need composure today. She needed only truth. Vanessa was led in by her attorney. She wore a muted gray suit, her hair pulled back tightly, makeup applied to hide the pallor that prison and stress had left on her skin. But the eyes were the same, calculating, constantly scanning, searching for a weak point in the walls, now closing in around her. Their gazes met for a brief moment. Margaret didn't look away. The proceedings began with the prosecution laying out the facts, the forged signatures, the siphoned trust funds, the orchestrated poisoning. They played the audio file aloud. Vanessa's voice filled the courtroom, confident, chilling, unmistakable in its intent. There was no outrage in the room, just silence. The silence of people realizing a woman they thought they knew was a stranger. When it was Margaret's turn to testify, she stood without needing assistance. She walked to the witness stand and took her oath. Her voice was steady as she recounted the morning Vanessa brought her coffee, the switch of the cups, the moment Vanessa collapsed, the F911 call, the arrival of the police, the days of sifting through Vanessa's lies to find the truth. I didn't speak out for years, she said, looking directly at the jury, because I didn't want to come between my son and his wife, because I thought, perhaps, I was imagining things, that my discomfort was a symptom of grief. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only gives cruelty a place to grow. Vanessa's attorney attempted a cross-examination, suggesting Margaret had acted irrationally, that she had misinterpreted signs due to age, loneliness, or resentment. Margaret answered each question with calm clarity. There was no anger in her voice, only conviction. She wanted me gone, Margaret said plainly, but I'm still here, because I trusted my instincts, because I know what love doesn't look like, and she never looked like love. By the end of her testimony, the courtroom felt changed. Even Vanessa seemed smaller, as though the truth had peeled something away from her, leaving only the fragile core beneath her armor. The trial didn't last long after that. Vanessa's lawyer negotiated a plea deal. She would face prison, but avoid the maximum sentence. The financial restitution would be handled by the state. She would never again be allowed custody of Jamie, and she would never come near Margaret or Lucas again. When the verdict was read guilty on all major counts, Vanessa didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply sat still, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that her performance had finally ended and the stage was gone. Outside, the sky had grown cloudy, the early promise of sun fading into overcast quiet. Margaret stepped down the courthouse steps with Lucas by her side, neither of them speaking. The world didn't cheer. There were no headlines shouted, no dramatic applause. Just a simple rhythm of heels on concrete and the whisper of justice. Finally caught up. They picked up Jamie later that afternoon. He was laughing with Helen, chocolate on his chin, and stories spilling out about a board game he'd won twice. He ran to Margaret and hugged her tightly. Did everything go okay today? He asked, childlike and curious. Margaret knelt beside him. It did, sweetheart. Is Mommy better? Margaret paused. No, but some things are safer now. He accepted that answer without further question, wrapping his arms around her again. That evening, they had dinner together in Margaret's home. A simple meal of roasted chicken, green beans, and baked potatoes, Jamie's favorite. They ate with light conversation, the mood gentle, unforced. There was no lingering shadow over the table, just three people trying to stitch their lives back together. After dinner, while Lucas cleaned the dishes, Margaret sat with Jamie on the porch swing. He leaned against her side, thumb in his mouth, nearly dozing. Nana, he murmured, can we go to the beach soon? She smiled. We will. Just us. Yes, she whispered. Just us. He fell asleep moments later, and Margaret sat there long after, watching the night sky unfold in stars. Later, in the quiet of her room, she opened her journal once more. Today was not the end of anything. It was the closing of one room in a long house, a room filled with shadows, yes, but also one where I found my strength. The woman who tried to erase me is gone, but I remain, not just standing but rooted, like the old outside my window, still, strong, silent only by choice. She closed the journal and set it aside. She walked into the hallway, checked on Jamie, tucked the covers around him. She kissed his forehead and whispered a promise to always protect him. Then she went downstairs and found Lucas finishing the dishes. He turned. How are you? I'm here, she said, and I'll be here tomorrow too. Lucas smiled, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a smile of guilt or hesitation. It was whole, real. Margaret went to bed that night with no fear, no lingering dread. Only the echo of her own footsteps carrying her through a home she had protected with everything she had. She lay beneath her quilt, the soft scent of lavender, in the room, and let her eyes close to the rhythm of her own breath. She had not just survived, she had reclaimed her life, and no one would ever silence her again.